Welcome. If you don't know me already, my name is Tori Sheppard. I am an INPP trained neurodevelopmental therapist in Coleraine, Northern Ireland. In case the accent is confusing, I have actually lived in the UK for over 3 decades and have raised my family mainly here in Northern Ireland. This interview is in response to the announcement earlier this week that Paul Givan, the Minister of Education for Northern Ireland, gave, saying that he is beginning his reform of the SEN system, that's the special educational needs system within education in Northern Ireland. This has been met with some emotion from the press, social media, parents, educators, because it is a topic that's filled with concern for many people, mainly parents and teachers. Parents who are in stress over what to do with their children in the midst of this. Teachers who are in stress over wanting to do the best for these children. And I come at this not only as a professional who's working with families every day in the midst of this navigation for them, and as a parent who found the road through trying to get help for my own children, not only in education, but in the NHS, enormously challenging. And it is a huge reason why I was led to this work. Which leads me to my guest today. When this announcement came, my first thoughts were that I longed for the policymakers and educators who will create this future for Northern Ireland to hear from one of the foremost experts in child development in the world and specialist in neurodevelopmental education, Sally Goddard Blythe. So I asked Sally if she would join me today in the hope of giving airtime to her thoughts and even advice at this critical moment for the future of education in Northern Ireland. She is an author of multiple books. Here is my stack of Sally Goddard books here. And she is also author of the go-to book for reflex integration over 20 years ago, which has now been published in its second edition last year with the recent research and science. But Sally can tell us more about her and her work. Sally, I am so grateful that you're here with us today. Could you please tell the audience a bit about your experience and research that gives you unique insights into this conversation of the future of SEN in schools?
So I probably need to start explaining what INPP does. So our main area of work is assessing children's physical skills to see if there are underlying physical factors that might be contributing to special educational needs, to underachievement, to behavioral and emotional issues, because often these have been completely overlooked and can play a significant part in a child's presenting symptoms. So that is largely done on a one-to-one individual basis within the private sector. And in 1996, a group of postgraduate students from the University of Hamburg came over and trained with us. And their question was, how can we take a part of this into the mainstream system so that schools can access not only a better understanding of how this affects children, but they can identify it and they can do something about it. So it was really in answer to that quandary that in 1996, I developed a simple screening test and physical developmental movement program, which I hoped could be used in schools. So the aim of the screening test was to help teachers to identify children who were underachieving, partly, not necessarily totally, as a result of underlying physical factors that hadn't previously been recognized. So they could be things like immature eye movements needed to support reading, hand-eye coordination needed to support writing, just the simple ability to sit still and focus attention on one task. These very basic things have a physical basis. So this screening test could provide a basis not only for identifying children in need, but recommending further investigations such as visual function, auditory processing, behavioral issues, and so on, while also providing a foundation for physical skills that could be re-evaluated following intervention. Because it's no good simply identifying something at a certain stage in development, throwing some form of intervention in, and then just waiting to see what happens, or if something happens. It's also necessary to reevaluate that at regular intervals to make sure that it's working, and if it's not, to look for alternatives. So that was the aim of the screening test, and the developmental movement program was primarily aimed at the children identified as being in need, but also was designed to be used with a whole class of children, so that it was an inclusive program and not something where children with special needs felt that they were taken out and removed from everybody else. It was meant to be simple to use, 10 minutes a day, 5 days a week during term time under teacher supervision, so that every child in that class or year group would get exactly the same input in terms of the physical program. So over the years, many schools have not only used it, but carried out pilot projects and written reports based on those pilot projects, some of which have been small scale and others which have been published as in peer-reviewed journals. And one of the really big studies that was done was actually carried out in Northern Ireland in 2004-2005 across 6 schools in County Antrim, involving more than 600 children.
Wow.
And it showed that 48% of 5 to 6-year-olds at the time in that sample, and 35% of 8 to 9-year-olds did not have the neuromotor skills at a level that would normally be expected for children of their age, and that there was a correlation between less mature motor skills and lower educational performance. In other words, they did not have all the physical tools in place to support the demands of the classroom. And a second part of that study also then investigated whether the movement program made a difference, and I'll come back to this a little bit later. So consistent findings over a 20-year period of studies carried out not just in the United Kingdom, but in Eastern Europe, in Mexico, in Spain, in Germany, and in Russia, as far as I know, and there may be other places as well, have all indicated that there is a value to the routine screening of children's neuromotor skills at the time of school entry, and again, at key stages through the education process. And the aims of this screening test are, just put my glasses on to remind myself, to identify children in need of support at the start of formal education. And again, I'll come back to why this is so important in a few minutes. To indicate a need for referral for specialist investigations, again, at the beginning of education. To evaluate progress following intervention, and to provide a basis for educational support in the classroom. So that's really the background in terms of my research and experience as to why I'm interested in the whole area of special needs and what I think could be done to help improve some of that area.
And could you speak into, you have mentioned the screening test. Can you speak into what some of the results are from the developmental movement program over the years?
Yes, where the program is being used with the population for which it was designed. So those are children with both immature neuromotor skills and starting to underachieve. Those children seem to show greater gains in reading than children who haven't done the program. One of the hidden findings is a significant improvement in a measure of what is called nonverbal cognitive performance. Now, that probably sounds like gobbledygook to it would have done to me many years ago. This means the nonverbal skills such as eye contact, recognizing body language, responding to body language correctly, knowing when to butt in, when not to speak, and so on. All these nonverbal skills, which actually support up to 90% of effective communication. Those were the things that showed one of the greatest gains in addition to the physical measures following the program. So that some of the schools that issued small-scale study reports talked about how children were better at settling to lessons, they were able to sit still for longer, they were able to carry on writing for longer, and would persevere with difficult tasks for longer. And the staff found that less staff supervision was required in the playground because as children's general body awareness was improving, so their spatial awareness was also getting better, and they were getting an improved understanding of where is a comfortable social space, not only for themselves, but for others. So they weren't invading other children's space. They weren't irritating other children as much, and they were able to socialize more effectively.
One part of the INPP school program that I so admire is the aspect of it affecting an entire classroom, not just those who are, quote, special needs. Could you speak into why it is designed in that way and some of what you have found from doing the program for every child?
I think it was designed that way for practical reasons, that teachers are so busy, they don't want to have to start making more and more small groups doing different interventions with them. So we felt that it would certainly not do the children who weren't in obvious need any harm. And we didn't anticipate that it would actually do them a great deal of good either.
Yes.
But some of the things I've mentioned, the sort of general self-regulation, the poise, and certainly the non-verbal skills improved even more in the children who apparently didn't need the program, as they did in the children who did need it. So we can show examples of children's drawing of the human figure, which provides a measure of non-verbal performance, where the age, mental age of that child in terms of performance has gone up 2 to 3 years in a 9-month period, when no special teaching in drawing or art has actually been done. It's simply their ability to recognize the human body from their own inner experience and then represent it in graphic form. And that shows you how their non-verbal skills are starting to mature.
So in some ways, the INPP school program can act as a form of safety net for those that are not already caught, as it were.
And what it seems to do is to pick up the underachievers, a hidden group who are not quite bad enough to be identified as having a special need. They are assumed to be doing well enough until you use the combination of the physical screening tests and things like the Draw a Person test. And then you think, oh my goodness, here's a child who could actually be doing much, much better. And we didn't realize that they weren't performing to potential.
Yes. And when we speak of neurodevelopmental education, we're often talking about a concept that we say is bottom up rather than top down. Would you mind speaking into the difference in a bottom up approach to education instead of a top down approach, and why right now, as we're looking at the future of education, why is this differentiation crucial for policymakers to understand from an economic and long-term perspective?
Yes.
Because I think right now is a moment that we can speak to the economists about education and the future of education. So could you speak into that?
So a top-down approach starts teaching the brain from the highest part, the most recently evolved part of the human brain, which takes a long time to develop in children. So we teach them facts, we teach them strategies of how to behave. And a bottoms-up approach looks at, do they have all the physical pieces in place to be able to benefit from that teaching, to understand what it means, to apply it, to use it, and so on. So if we look at this in terms of a sort of services that are provided by every country's government, we see this happening in so many different sectors, and education is similar to the national health system in this respect. When there is a need to systemize something, to organize it, it creates a need for top-heavy, top-down management. Everybody thinks from the top, and they think as adults do in their attempts to solve problems of the children's brain. Children the other way around, they start from the bottom, and although the top is developing all the time, it needs these roots and branches, trunk and branches to develop first in order for the leaves and everything else to flourish later on. So when we have a top-heavy management system that's using a lot of resources at the top, it starts to scavenge from the resources that are actually needed at the bottom. So in the case of the health service, what patients really need is they need access to doctors, to nurses, to carers, to physios, to radiographers, and so on. And children are exactly the same. They need the early years skills in place. They need the teachers who understand whether they're ready, and the teachers to recognize where that child is developmentally and start their teaching from the point where the child is at that moment in time, rather than saying, no, this is what you've got to start learning up here. If the child is down here in their development, they can't access this higher form of teaching. They need to build the pieces from the bottom upwards. So as a system, we insist that children are put into a funnel at rising 5 years of age, assuming that those skills are in place.
Mm-hmm.
And we let them continue through that system, generally until they start to fail in some way. And some children may start to show signs of failure very early. And if they're lucky, they might be picked up and something will be done. But more often than not, it's 2 to 3 years into the education system before they're picked up. The process of referral, which is coming from the top down, not from a point of child need upwards, just as I said that medicine ideally should be patient need directed, so this should be child need directed. The process of referral can take a further year to 18 months, and if they're lucky, they may or may not receive a diagnosis. And diagnosis can be helpful if there is an effective remedy available to put in place. But more often than not, that diagnosis can simply become a label, which allows everybody involved to sit back and say, now we know what it is. We can't expect them to do better than that. So all we do is just put in the support that we can. And so nobody has bothered to look to see why. What are the mechanics that are built up to the symptom of underachievement? And in some cases, it's obvious. There might be a medical problem from very early on. There might be socioeconomic factors that have prevented a child from having a nurturing environment and have contributed to underachievement. These things we can look at and we can provide support and strategies for. But if there is a deficit in that child's neuromotor skills, it doesn't matter how good their intelligence is, and in many cases, how good the teaching is. Until that gap is bridged, they are not going to be able to perform to their true level of potential. So the bottoms-up approach says, let's start looking at where this child is now, what they can, what they can't do, where the gap is between the expectations, and let's see if we can build some of these physical skills in to enable them to start functioning to the level that they are really capable of.
So something like the INPP school program would be a bottom-up approach.
Yes. It would be one bottom-up approach. And I mean, it is only one of many. And I was going to sort of go back and say, so if we're looking at starting from the bottom, where is the bottom? Where do we begin? And the first thing is prevention. Is what can we do in the early years, from the moment, not even when a child is born, but preconception? How can we ensure that parents can provide the best possible physical and nurturing environment for that child? How do we ensure that in the preschool years, the child gets the opportunities, the experience to develop those physical skills so that they are ready, and those self-care skills? We hear a lot in the news about children starting school, not able to take themselves to the toilet, change for pee, and so on. So also those skills are important too. So what's done in the early years is incredibly important. But also then the implementation of routine assessment at different stages, to be able to pick out when a child does have need, particularly I think at school entry, so that we are the school, the teacher that child is going to be, whose care that child is going to be under, knows from the outset that here are 4 or 5 children in my class this year who are going to need a bit of extra support with physical development. How do we do it? What do we do? And so on. And then, as I've talked about, that follow-up evaluation at key stages later on to make sure that nobody has got missed somewhere because they've changed schools, they've changed countries, something has happened that means that they weren't flagged up initially. So let me just remind myself I haven't forgotten anything. I think, as I've touched on, that whole process as it is now waits until failure or underachievement is already in place. When
Yes.
help or intervention assessment comes in, it comes in 3 to 5 years too late. And those children will probably never fully catch up. That a child learns more in the first 7 years of life than we learn for the remainder of our entire life, however long we live. So if a child is underachieving from 5 to 8 and nobody has bothered to look at why, nobody has provided the support because the assessment hasn't been done, that child is seriously disadvantaged in terms of their ability to go on to achieve what they should be capable of later on.
Yes, and I'm sure there will be now all kinds of talk about how many classroom assistants should be in a class and how much money should be spent on classroom assistants and sensory rooms and all sorts of top-down approaches. But what you're saying is that if we would dare to take the time and the resources at the bottom and to build. And what would you say about those children who they do find an assessment that says this child needs help? What is help that education could help to make available for those children that is looking at it from a bottom up?
If we went back to the 1980s, every child was assessed by a school medical officer at rising 5 years of age for basic test for vision, for hearing, standing on one leg, hopping to one end of the room and back again. And then we entered an era of evidence-based medicine, where if a problem was found, it was necessary to have a remedy in order to justify the continued assessment. And because they didn't really know what to do with many of these children, they said, well, we don't really need to keep screening them anymore. So I'm not saying that the INPP school program is by any means the only screening test. I only devised it because I felt it was something that was simple, it was easy to use, and it seemed to pick up problems at quite a low level, which from, I suppose, a financial economic point of view is not a great thing, because governments don't necessarily want to have to put that money in early. But on the other hand, if they did, they may save themselves thousands of pounds several years down the line in providing many of the supports that you've just described.
If we think about it in terms of the entire UK, we'd be talking millions.
Yes.
In terms of what it could save for
Yes.
for education. So what do you think is the way forward?
I think if we start again from the bottom and we say prevention where possible, and I would say that could begin as early as secondary education for teenagers, starting with the parents of the future, educating them as part of their personal and social development about the universal biological needs of children. We're very good at providing sex education and gender education and all sorts of things, but actually the product of sex is children. And the chances are many of those teenagers are going on to produce them later on. And if, as part of their education, they were taught what babies need, of course they need warmth, they need good nutrition, and they need love. But they also need the opportunity and experience for physical interaction with the world and social engagement. And those two things are the environmental software that help to build the connections within the brains of developing children. We have the hardware, hardwired in at birth, but it doesn't automatically develop by itself. It needs that interaction and engagement in order to develop in sociable and productive ways. So help the next generation of parents understand what they can do. It doesn't cost any money to put your baby on the floor on a clean blanket and allow it to kick its legs, wave its arms, and to have free movement. It costs nothing to swing them around and to play with them and to talk to them. But it does take a knowledge that it's important and the time and the patience to do it. And not all parents of the future or of now have a good experience of having been parented themselves. And so much of parenting is absorbed osmotically from what has happened to you. And so the next stage is support of parents in the early years to provide them with what they need so they can give those fertile, nurturing environments. And that will depend not just on socioeconomic groups, but on and status, but the demands on those parents, whether they're working parents, whether they're having to do 2 or 3 jobs, whether there are support systems in place or whatever. But somehow society has, I think, a responsibility to provide a more supportive environment for new parents of very young children. We talked about the routine of children's screening at the time of school entry, and the training of teachers, I think, is important.
It's a big thing. Absolutely.
Yeah. That teachers are taught how to teach.
Yes.
But very few of them these days have in their training modules on the importance of physical development to support effective learning. About 15 years ago, I was invited to go and give a training day to probationary teachers who had just about completed their first year of probationary teaching. And I asked how many of them had heard of Piaget, well-known scientist in the past, who talked about the sensory and motor stages of development, and also about education linked to those things. One hand went up.
Wow.
In that group of 25 teachers. I then asked them how many of them had had any training in the importance of physical development to support learning, and not one hand went up. So teachers are doing the best they can, but unless they themselves have undergone some sort of education in why physical development is not only important to support learning, but also can enhance the learning process itself. So when I was a child, I'm old enough to have learnt my tables, my Latin verbs, everything, to songs, to rhymes, to actions. And, I'm going to be 70 in a couple of years' time. And all these years later, I can still remember those things if somebody starts to sing me the first 2 notes of a tune or they make the actions. And that information is stored in a specific part of the brain, like a library, to be accessed when you have a problem to solve later on. So when you are, as a teacher, you are trying to teach a child a new skill that it doesn't understand first time round. Some children will, by linking that new information to something physical, something concrete, then often they start to gain an understanding. So training teachers to recognize how physical things can be brought into their classroom can also help, I think, to support education in other ways.
Absolutely.
And then finally, we come to your the policymakers, who I have a lot of sympathy for, because it's very easy to talk about the detail, but to implement that detail into something that works for all is much harder. But for them to understand that the development of the whole child matters. Education is not something that you go in, you're taught, and you come out the other end. For some children, it is. They're lucky enough to get through that. But there's a very large number of children who don't learn in the same way. And a piecemeal system that focuses on bites of repair when damage or deficit has occurred are not sufficient to make up the problem that exists today. And that's what I see. I see a piecemeal system where families, if they're lucky, get the support they need. If they're persistent, they might get more support. But it doesn't fall in their laps, and many of them don't know how or where to begin.
Yes, and it leaves everyone feeling lack. It leaves
Yes,
the teachers feeling that they don't know what to do to help these children. The parents don't know how to get them support. The children themselves are left adrift. So everyone is at lack because of that. I wanted to go back just to say that the part that you were talking about that teachers didn't know.
Mhm.
I when I was trained, when I was actually had the privilege of being trained by you for my INPP training, I remember sitting there and trying to hold back tears because I actually have a degree in child development and education, and I wasn't taught in my degree many of the things that I learned about child development in my INPP training that I thought if I had known this
Mhm.
as a teacher, I could have been a better teacher and I could have been a better parent and in so many ways. And so much of it was foundational teaching about the way that development wires the brain. And it would be so incredible to see that teaching in the teacher institutions. And we have very good ones in Northern Ireland. And it would be incredible to see that that is the kind of education that our teachers are leaving with.
Yes, yes,
And very powerful for the children that they could work with.
yes. Everybody benefits.
Everyone would benefit. So do you have a closing message to educators or policymakers in Northern Ireland, but for, you know, a wider message about what we could do um, for the future of education?
I think be brave enough not to only look forwards,
Mm,
but to look back.
mm,
Go back and look at features of successful education in the past and have the courage to revive these in the face of a drive to replace things with technology. I'm not a Luddite. I use technology, and technology has brought all sorts of benefits to us. But in my view, technology was designed to provide tools for life, not
mm,
to become the way of life. So while it can help support all sorts of aspects of education, there were also old-fashioned ways which actually worked for generations. And the evolution of the human brain is a very, very slow process. What worked 50 years ago probably still works today. And much of it was discarded, or as my late husband used to say, people tend to throw out the baby with the dirty bathwater.
mm,
Something
mm,
new comes along. Oh, this is better. Let's use this. It may well be better,
mm,
but sometimes you discard what was already there
mm,
at your peril.
mm,
So go back and have a look, re-examine some of those things and say, what were the features? I mean, one of my um, platforms sometimes when I'm training is to say, when there is a sort of economic crunch, the first teachers to go in primary education to be considered not important are generally the physical education teacher and the music teacher.
mhm.
And these two are possibly the foundations of primary education.
Yes.
But we talked, why physical skills are important, but music helps to improve auditory discrimination needed for reading, for spelling, for speaking, auditory processing, rhythm for interaction, memory, um, planning, motor planning, all sorts of things. And that music, just like physical movements, can be used to support the learning of new material. It's not an isolated skill. And so many studies have shown that children who play a musical instrument are actually better at certain cognitive skills than those that don't. It enhances every aspect of learning. So we should not be discarding, we should not be throwing the PE teachers and the music teachers out with the bathwater. We should be recognizing that these so-called soft skills actually are incredibly important in supporting the later outcomes. So again, it's that bottom-up versus top-down approach, recognizing that only when we meet a child where they are in their development and thinking, can learning become effective, meaningful, and applicable, and that therefore learning with development is the key.
That is so helpful, Sally. Thank you. My hope is that your words will find a landing in the ear
Maybe one day.
policymakers, educators that have influence. And for any of the viewers that may be teachers, we within INPP are offering training in the school program this year. One of the training, if you can mobilize yourself quickly, is in Welling Garden City in February, at the end of February, so you can find out about that. But there are two that are coming up in March. The one is I am hosting it at Map and Compass Neurodevelopmental Therapy here in Coleraine, and it will be led by INPP, the UK trainer, Pauline Shannon. She's coming over from Edinburgh to do that training, but there is an author-led training by Sally Goddard Blythe on is it the 22nd? 27th of March in Chester. So that could be worth even, it could be that there are even some of these policymakers that want to make it over to have those conversations with you and to be a part of that, to understand what this is from the bottom up. But I would certainly invite any teacher who would like to begin to implement that from as soon as next year in their own schools and in their classrooms. They could begin to do that, to be a part of that training. I'll just close with this. Northern Ireland is a small place, and yet we have enormous influence and influence in the world. It is possible, with our most optimistic hat on here, it is possible that we could implement changes within the education structure here that could act as a pilot for many places in the rest of the world. And that is not too big of a dream to believe for. And that is why I very much wanted to have the voice of Sally Goddard Blythe with us today. And Sally, I'm sure that if I speak for you to say that you would be able to be contacted through your website, sally.blythe.co.uk, and people could get in touch with you if they would like to hear more from you. Certainly, any of her many books are available online at any of the bookstores that you would go to. And like I said, this is her latest book that came out last year, along with the second edition of the school program that just came out at the end of the year. So thank you very much, Sally, for being with us. And we must hope that these words will be effective for the future. Thank you very much.